The unsurpassed, penetrating, and perfect truth is seldom met with, even in 100,000 myriad kalpas. Now we can see and hear it. We can remember and accept it. I vow to make the Buddha's truth one with myself. Homage to the Buddha, homage to the Dharma, homage to the Sangha. Well, I would like to talk about the 8 worldly conditions, which are also known as the 8 winds or the 8 great distractions. And we did the Shurangama ceremony a few days ago, and they used the word 8 great distractions, and I was really intrigued by that because they are what distracts us from what we truly long for. And so the 8 worldly conditions are fame and disgrace, gain and loss, elation and sorrow, and praise and blame. And John Sumedho, in his book Don't Take Your Life Personally, says this about the 8 worldly conditions. And his teacher, as probably a lot of you know, was Ajahn Chah. And Ajahn Chah encouraged people to contemplate these 8 worldly dhammas, he called them dhammas, because on the conventional plane we experience them continually. But his advice was always to see them as of equal value, praise and blame of equal value, success and failure of equal value, happiness and suffering of equal value, good fortune and bad fortune of equal value. This isn't just an intellectual exercise, but a way of developing awareness when things arise. Our refuge is in our awareness rather than in our feelings of happiness or praise, happiness at praise, resentment at blame, and so forth. And this was emphasized over and over again during my monastic training in Thailand. So I thought this was a good time to talk about the 8 worldly conditions. I was initially going to just talk about praise and blame, but I think this is a time when people are experiencing loss, and I think it's a good time to talk about gain and loss, and also elation and sorrow, because there's probably a lot of grief and sorrow in the world right now, maybe more so than usual. And we may be experiencing the grief of what's going on in the world. When you see that people are afraid, people are getting ill, people are getting sick, the normalcy, I don't know if that's really a word. My computer didn't think it was. Oh, good, you do. The normalcy of our daily life is gone. It's different now. Perhaps we're not as affected as some other people, but people have to change their plans. You can't go to your regular medical appointments. You can't travel. In some areas, they've been asked not to even leave their house. So it's a time of loss, and it can be a time of even greater loss, if people get sick and die, or people who, aren't able to work now because they're asked to stay home. They're losing their income. They're losing what they normally do, and it can be really hard. When the negative side of these 8 great conditions arise, they can seem overwhelming. Criticism or blame can send us on a downward cycle. When Reverend Master Jiyu, who was my master, would blame me for something, it would take a week, at least a week, before I could recover. It was just like, oh my God. Grief can seem overwhelming, as can loss and disgrace. And to see them as just winds that pass through us, that pass through everyone, really helps us to deal with them, because gain and fame and elation and praise are actually just empty. They're all just empty. And I used to love it, of course, when I'd give a talk, and I'd get a lot of praise. And sometimes I'd kind of, even if I'm talking about praise and blame, I'd kind of listen to see, is anyone going to say anything? And I also knew that most likely within a few days I'd be blamed for something. So you could see that it just went back and forth. But now, even if I get praised for something, I know it's not what I'm truly looking for, and it just doesn't do. I mean, of course, you have this self that goes, "Oh, wonderful, wonderful," but it really doesn't do much because it's not the truth. It's just winds. It's just distractions. They are something we can contemplate and train with, especially during this time of change and loss. There's an interesting story in this book that I've been reading for the second time, The Book of Joy by, Douglas Abrams put it together, but it's about His Holiness the Dalai Lama and Archbishop Desmond Tutu, where they get together for a week and discuss what creates joy and what is detrimental to joy. And there was something that I read in here about loss that I thought would be helpful. It's about a person named James Dory. Maybe I'll just tell you the story. He was the founder and director of the Center of Compassion and Altruism Research and Education at Stanford and the chairman of the Dalai Lama Foundation. He also worked as a full-time neurosurgeon, and he had made something like $75 million. He was an entrepreneur. And I guess a lot of his money was in the stock market, and he had set aside, I think, $30 million for charity. And the stock market crashed. He lost all his money except for the money he had designated for charity. And his lawyers told him that he could probably get that money back considering his situation. And he thought about it, and then he gave it all away to charity because he said, I was very poor as a young person, and having all this money did not bring happiness. The only happiness you get out of money is by giving it away. So you could see that he probably was happier without his millions of dollars. So it just shows you that loss can be a time of turning things around, as can all these what we think of as negative worldly conditions. And when life is difficult, when it's very difficult, sometimes a window opens up. A window, I guess, into impermanence or uncertainty, the unknown, or just a window into going deeper within ourselves. And there's a nice story in this book called Kitchen Table Wisdom, which is by Rachel Naomi Riemann, MD. And she was a doctor, and she became a counselor and saw a lot of people who were diagnosed with cancer. And I want to read you this story here about someone who had cancer. Many of the people who come to talk about their cancer have ended up telling me that they have in some fundamental way felt alone all their lives. They have felt loved and valued by others for what they can do, but not for who they are. And they have loved and valued themselves in this same way. They have had relationships, lived among families, had neighbors, and worked with others, yet they have felt they have never really known the people around them or been known by them. Their cancer has made them aware of this for the first time. Paradoxically, for some, the profoundly isolating experiences of illness have begun to heal this sense of aloneness. Often this can come about slowly and not because of any deliberate action on their part, not by reading a book, taking a course, or even starting a meditative practice. Some people who have discovered the most genuine sense of connection, belonging, and altruism have discovered it completely by surprise. One woman told me that she had found her way to the great simplicity of living with an open heart by crawling a long way on her knees in the dark. During her bone marrow transplant, she had felt a terrible anger, envy, and resentment. She had drowned in self-pity and experienced a vulnerability and sense of isolation so profound it had no words. She had never before allowed herself this depth of feeling, and she had felt overwhelmed by it. It had been frightening and painful, but in the end it had burned away the habits of thought and belief that had separated her from other people and left her with an unshakable sense of belonging and connection. In the midst of her suffering and helplessness, she had one day simply known that all suffering was like her suffering, and all joy was like her joy. From this has come an enduring inner change, a kindness that is almost involuntary. I'm going to skip a little bit here. Perhaps the healing of the world rests on just this sort of shift in our way of seeing, a coming to know that in our suffering and our joy we are connected to one another with unbreakable and compelling human bonds. In that knowing, all of us become less vulnerable and alone. The heart, which can see these connections, may be far more powerful a source of healing than the mind. And I think people are trying to connect in this very difficult worldwide situation. I was looking at some of the things that Reverend Koten sent around to people on his E-Tree list, and it showed people in Italy singing from their balconies and singing with each other and talking to each other from their balconies. And this one opera singer with this incredible voice, it was beautiful, singing from his balcony. And then I think a female opera singer singing with somebody playing the violin. So people are reaching out to each other in this crisis. And they also showed this, I think 6 policemen with masks on and gloves, and they were singing in Indian. They were in India. They put the words in English, but they were singing "Wash your hands, wash your hands." And they were just bouncing around, and it was really sweet. And then they showed something where these rabbis in, I think it was Jerusalem, at the the wall, the Wailing Wall, with all these people offering prayers for the Chinese. And it just showed that people have good hearts, and they reach out to each other. And this one doctor was saying, wash your hands, keep your distance, and help those who are in need. Do grocery shopping for people who can't get out. So there's a lot of good going on in this situation. So in very difficult situations, good can come out of it, and we don't know yet what's going to happen. It's a time of uncertainty, and maybe there will be some good that comes out of it. In the Book of Joy, the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu talk about the good that's come out of their lives with the very difficult situations they've been in. The Dalai Lama, of course, lost his country. Many of his people were tortured and killed, put in prison. He witnessed a lot of suffering, and yet he talked about the good that's come out of that. And how much good he has done for the world. What a change he has made in the world by just people getting to know him. And it was lovely. He and Desmond Tutu both felt that they were just one person among 7 million. And that's how they treated people, just like we're all just the same. And Desmond Tutu witnessed apartheid in South Africa and the deep suffering of the people down there. And then when apartheid ended, he was part of the Truth and Reconciliation. How did page 3 get before page 2? There it is. Okay. He was part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to help people who had done so much harm to confess their crimes and to be forgiven by those who had harmed and who had been harmed, and by the relatives of people who sometimes brutally killed. And again, it just showed kind of the nobility of people and what people can rise to in difficult situations. And this is what Desmond Tutu says in this section in the book called Forgiveness, Freeing Ourselves from the Past. I have seen remarkable instances of forgiveness carried out by people we would not have thought could possibly do it, the Archbishop began. In one instance, during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we had mothers of some young people who had been lured by those working with the apartheid system into a booby trap where they were killed. One of the mothers said she switched on her television set and saw the body of her son being dragged. And apart from her anguish at the death of her son, there was a deep, deep anger at his body being treated as if it were the carcass of an animal. You know, when these mothers came to the commission, they were quite amazing, really, because no one demanded that they should forgive these people. They called them Askaris, who were formerly members of the African National Congress, who then turned and supported the government forces. The one who betrayed these young people came and appeared in front of these mothers and asked for their forgiveness. When the mother of the young man who had been dragged through the street saw the traitor, she took off her shoe and threw it at him. The Archbishop said, laughing and pretending to throw a shoe with his left hand. We had to adjourn for a little while, but then during the break came a totally fantastic moment as they sat there and their spokesperson said, the Archbishop closed his eyes, remembering the unbelievable power of her words. My child, she said, my child. So this one who had been responsible for the death of their children, she said, my child, we forgive you. When we asked her about the granting of amnesty, she said, what is it going to help us if he were to go to prison? It won't bring back our children. And there is an incredible kind of nobility and strength. Yet it's difficult, but it has happened. In this group of mothers, the one who was speaking on their behalf got up and went across the room to this guy who had been responsible for the killing of their sons and embraced him and said, my child. I don't know, there was just maybe a slight detour there, but I thought it was very, very good. When I was the infirmarian, or that's what we called the nurse who was here, I remember seeing on the top of a hot air humidifier, vaporizer, these words which I had to chuckle at, which were, if all else fails, read the instructions. And it really said that. And I used to think, if all else fails, look within. So I think this is a good time for us to be looking within. When things get really difficult, sometimes it's just the impetus it takes for us to really look at ourselves. And no matter whether we think we have faith or not, we don't have a choice. We have to look within, especially those of us who have this meditation practice. But others as well. What else can you do? You have to trust. And I remember I've had lots of instances of this, but I'll just mention one, which was last fall. For some reason, I was just experiencing a lot of depression and despair. and I was really trying to get out of it. And I would sit in front of my light box regularly, and I tried to do fast walking, which is supposed to help, and nothing seemed to help. And then one day I just felt like, I don't care anymore. I'm just going to go into this despair. And what came up for me was, if I found out that I was going to die, would I give in to this despair? And the answer was no. I would have no choice. I'd had to have faith. I mean, everything is taken away from you when you're going to die, and you can't afford to have despair. You have to go into it. So I let go of the despair, and I looked at what had to be looked at. And this is what has happened with me. When things have gotten really difficult, I've had to look within. So I think this is a time for us to look within. And we've added to our schedule a 4 o'clock meditation period on most days. And I find that really helpful. It's a time for us to be quiet and still and look within and offer merit. It's a time to offer merit to the world. And this is something that we can do. We can look within, have faith and trust, and offer merit. Because the world needs merit right now. And that example that I gave you shows us that something is always there helping us. I find for myself, I don't always feel good. I have my difficulties. I think I always will. But when I need it, there is something there helping me. And sometimes I have to cry out for help. And sometimes there's just a slight shift, but there's always something there, and we can rely on that. And as part of the 8 worldly conditions, there's elation and sorrow or grief. Perhaps this is a time when we're feeling grief for the world. Maybe we feel helpless, but we have to not be afraid of the grief. This is part of the human condition, and it connects us to others. This grief connects us to others. And if we feel grief, just see it as a worldly condition. It's something that comes and goes. And when we feel it, and when it's gone, it's gone. And it can help us to offer merit to those who are grieving and to be kind to ourselves. I realized when I was out at the Hermitage, I always get a sense of what kind of a monk I would like to be. I sometimes touch on that a bit, and then I have this ideal of how I would like to be. And of course, I never can be that way. I never, maybe for a moment. But what came up for me was all I can be is, I'm always going to have difficulties. I'm always going to have shortcomings. I'm always going to make mistakes. And it's okay. Because I'm always going to pick myself up and keep on going. And I'm always going to try to do my best. But it's never going to be easy. And I'm never going to be that perfect monk. And that's okay. That's okay. There's a nice little thing in here in the Book of Joy about compassion for ourselves. If I can find it. I thought I put all of these little markers here. Psychologist Kristen Neff has identified ways to express self-compassion. When we treat ourselves with compassion, we accept that there are parts of our personality that we may not be satisfied with, but we do not berate ourselves as we try to address them. When we go through a difficult time, we are caring and kind to ourselves as we would be to a friend or relative. When we feel inadequate in some way, we remind ourselves that all people have these feelings or limitations. When things are hard, we recognize that all people go through similar challenges. And finally, when we are feeling down, we try to understand this feeling with curiosity and acceptance rather than rejection or self-judgment. Now, that brings us to praise and blame. And I'd like to give an example from Don't Take Your Life Personally. Ajahn Sumedho trained with Ajahn Chah for many years in Thailand. Then he was encouraged by his teacher to establish a branch monastery in England. Many monks and nuns came to train with him, and he said he had many successes and failures in about the first 10 years. And even though he had many successes and failures, he said they were basically good years. They were building a monastery or monasteries. They were working together. And then after about 10 years, everybody began to criticize him. And especially the nuns. They didn't like the way he was treating them, and they had lots of criticism for him. And Ajahn Sumedho was very honest about himself. He said he cannot stand criticism, that he is devastated by it. And he had an experience of which he called of the sound of silence. I don't know if some of you have heard him talk about that, but I'll just read you. I won't read the whole thing because I've been doing a lot of reading. He was walking in England, and he had a sense of what he called the sound of silence. And he wrote, a kind of cosmic background vibration, a sound unlike sound as we generally think of it, with a beginning and ending, a stream-like ongoing, flowing sound. And with it a sense of boundlessness and emptiness. It was a powerful experience. After that, I began to recognize the sound of silence with this emptiness more and more. And he also saw that this was a way that he could be when there was criticism. He could just be still within that sound, within that awareness. And even if we haven't had a great experience of this place of boundlessness and emptiness, we've all had some experiences of being still. And this is how we can accept criticism or blame. And he began to realize it was a way to deal with blame. He realized that here he says, that I was aware of my own reactivity without acting on it. I realized that if I trusted this awareness, I could receive my own reactions to what others were saying. This gave me the spaciousness and consciousness for the world to come and go with all its pleasure, pain, praise, and blame. And I put this to the test in the monastic community one winter. I was not on good terms with the nuns at that time and asked them to give me some feedback. So we arranged some meetings. I told them there would be no forbidden subjects and that they were free to say whatever they wanted, especially around their relationship with me. The meetings were open-ended so that they could start in the afternoon and go until the evening or until it was obviously time to stop. I was determined not to defend myself, not to blame others, and not to follow any feelings of wanting to set them straight. I did, however, allow myself to apologize if I felt an apology was appropriate. I decided that, even if I didn't agree with them or saw things differently, I would not argue the point. Each one of us sees things the way we see them, and I knew that none of the nuns were going to tell me a lie. So it wasn't a question of trying to prove whose angle was the right one, but of just listening, which I did. They told me things that were quite painful to hear, actually, about how I had disappointed them, failed them, lost their respects. Things like that can break your heart. To receive the criticism and your own reactions at the same moment, however, is possible. Awareness gives us that capability. It was hard going sometimes, of course, and I would occasionally go back to my room feeling as though I had been in the ring with a prize fighter. But I didn't chicken out, and the following day went back again. At the end of a month there was nothing more to say, and it seemed to have resolved itself. It seemed that an amazing kind of transformation had taken place. Everybody had had an opportunity to speak, and I had found my own strength to receive blame. The blame no longer frightened me, and that experience later helped me to receive praise as well. I got a lot of praise, but no longer depend on it in order to feel worthwhile. If awareness is your refuge, the personality will be received and accepted, and you can learn from it, but you will no longer be limited and bound into those habit patterns or that cultural conditioning you acquired while growing up. So with blame, I notice for myself that even if something is not even really blame, but even just kind of touches on it a little bit, I can feel this reaction coming up. And yet I don't have to respond. And when you don't respond, when you allow the feelings to be there and to go, you let go of a lot of suffering. And also, I won't read this to you, I'll spare you another reading, but John Sumedo talks about the inner critic, that the blame that comes from himself is much, much more critical than could ever come from anyone else. Okay. I'm going to end with a prayer that apparently has been circulating throughout Europe. And this was sent to one of our monks, and it says, "We have no idea who to attribute this to, but it's an idealistic prayer which is now circulating throughout Europe. And the people stayed home, and read books and rested, and exercised, and made art, and played games, and learned new ways of being, and were still, and they began to listen more consciously. Some meditated, some prayed, some danced, some met their shadows, and these people began thinking differently. The people began to heal. And in the absence of people living in ignorant, mindless, and heartless ways, the earth began to heal. And when the danger finally passed, the people joined together again. They grieved their losses and made new choices and dreamed new visions and created new ways of living and of healing this world fully, as they themselves were being healed." And I think I like that because it shows that we are all so connected to each other, and we all have a good heart, and we all want things to be different, and we all want to change, and we're all just doing the best we can. So, thank you.